Hi, hello everybody. My name is Philip Rubin, and I'm the president of FABBS, the Federation of Associations in Behavioral and Brain Sciences. I'm also the CEO Emeritus of Haskins Laboratories and a professor adjunct at Yale University Department of Surgery. Formerly, I was an administrator at the National Science Foundation and was also the principal Assistant Director for Science. I led the Science Division at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy in the Obama administration. FABBS is a coalition of 28 scientist societies and nearly 60 academic departments. We represent the interests of our members here in Washington, D.C. on a wide range of federal budget policy and practice issues. We also serve as a resource to our members for scientists interested in engaging, flagging opportunities to connect research to policy, and facilitating training, which is why I'm pleased to welcome you to this seminar, to this webinar. It is my pleasure, extremely great pleasure, to have Lizzy Ghedi-Ehrlich, the Director of Policy for the Scholars Strategy Network, SSN. In this role, she focuses on helping college and university-based researchers build lasting, productive relationships with policy decision makers. FABBS has appreciated the opportunity to partner with SSN as we have some shared goals and play complementary roles to achieve them. We have a lot of people participating today, and we hope there'll be an opportunity to have some discussions. So if there is, feel free at the end to raise your real or virtual hand or put a comment or question in the chat. Also, if you're able, please put your affiliation on either your picture by clicking on the three dots if you can see them, or if you can't, putting your name and affiliation in the chat. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Lizzy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Philip, for that lovely introduction. And thank you, Julianne, of course, for working with us. SSN loves working with folks from FABBS, and all of our services and support are open to you. So not just the workshop that you're all about to sit through, but one-on-one help for projects that you might have if you really have something that you'd like to bring to the attention of someone working at an agency. We are going to be moving at a pretty blazing fast clip today because there's a lot to cover. So I'm glad for the recording. Hopefully you will all get things out of it. Jacqueline, are we able to share the slides? Yes, there we go. All right. Okay, great. Thank you. So that's us. So agenda for the next hour, we're going to be covering basics of government agencies, their actions and responsibilities, and what researchers in particular would benefit from knowing about their structure and their politics. Hopefully, as Philip said, we will have some time for maybe sharing out some of the ideas that you're interested in bringing to them so that your peers can let you know what they're hearing. And then if we have time, we're going to cover how to form lasting relationships with government agencies and build trust. We have some templates for actually reaching out to them in ways that are proven to be effective. I would love now, since we're such a big group, for folks to start putting in the chat, introducing yourself, your name, and if you came to this training with something in mind to communicate to an agency, just one phrase or a short sentence on what you're looking to communicate to an agency staffer. What is the thing that you know from your work that someone at an agency ought to know? And we'll just kind of let those scroll in as we start talking so that I'll be able to review them and we can see who else is in the room and what they're working on. So government agencies, next slide. We know that when researchers are looking to engage in policymaking, it can be such a crowded field. There's legislators, civic leaders, courts, and government agencies, just to name a few. So for folks who want to make an impact, it's really important to narrow in on which kind of policy actor is the right partner for you. We're here today for folks who think agencies might be it. And to start off with, we just want to give a definition of government agencies. It's a broad term that covers public institutions meant to carry out government services. So they're given the work of actually implementing policy that's passed by legislators, and they're the ones who deliver government services. Next slide. We're going to dig a little deeper into what they do, what their responsibilities are, and what they have authority over. This is going to help you as you decide who your targets should be for your outreach. So implementing policies. They're primarily focused on policy implementation, whether that's the state's legislative body enacting new laws or executive leadership, like a governor or mayor directing new policies through executive action. It's government agencies that are typically the entity that carries out the policy function, often working out a lot of the details and logistics and delivering desired outcomes to constituents. On rulemaking, agencies have their own legislating power through the act of rulemaking. So what this means is that particulars of legislation can sometimes be left to agencies to decide, with agencies making key decisions on rules and regulations. Monitoring and reporting. They're often tasked with monitoring and reporting on the impact or success of a given policy. And this can be really crucial, as these reports made to the legislature will inform the future of the policy. Sometimes that's mandated research written into a policy that outside researchers can assist in. Part of implementing policy, of course, is providing government services. So for many, the most contact that people have with government comes from engaging in programs with social services, public health, education. Think enrolling in Medicaid, sending your kids to school, cities trash collection. These are all government services that are handled by agencies. Next, because of their role in implementing policies and delivering services, agencies are also responsible for external facing work like communicating policy changes, service opportunities, and critical messaging to the public. So for example, we've all become, quite familiar with your local and state health departments, or even the CDC sending updated guidelines on how to minimize spread of COVID. So through this practice, agencies have a really unique insight into and contact with constituents. Agencies are also involved in the legislative process. So during the legislative session, agencies are called on to review relevant bills. They're providing feedback on a policy's impact, effectiveness, costs, answering questions from legislators. So staff will also often provide testimony in response to a bill, and they have considerable influence on legislators in many states, though they're often thought of as the subject matter experts. They're sort of a government analog to you as researchers. And then, of course, they conduct their own research to improve the efficacy and impact of their programs and services. And their ability to do this depends on the individual agency's funding and capacity. So it's most common at the federal level, which is mostly what we're focusing on today. But agencies will often work with universities and college partners to conduct this research as well, which is cool for all of you. And now that we've laid out, what agencies are able to do, it's a good moment to pause and think about your own mindset toward the agency that you're imagining contacting. Why do you want to connect to someone at that agency and present your research or expertise there? What's your reason for doing that? And Julianne actually brought this to my attention when we were talking about this training, and I think it's really correct. Ask yourself, does my mission comport with the agency I'm targeting's mission? Does my reason for reaching out to them serve this mission? And if that's a little muddy for you right now, I hope the next few slides, as we work through different agency types and how their personnel typically functions, might help you clarify a bit what you're actually looking to do as you begin this project. And so for the next slide, break down government agencies. Again, I was told that most folks here would probably be looking to engage at the federal level. And if you're part of FABBS, then you're already part of an organization that has, some useful ways to help you with those contacts. But it's important that we actually match what we're trying to do with who does it. So we're breaking down the different kinds of government agencies you might work with. There's two aspects: issue area focus and regional focus. So you're probably familiar with how they're divided by issue focus. For example, health, housing, education, labor, transportation, the agencies list, but they also exist across localities. There's the federal, state, county, and city agencies, and finding the one that's the best fit for you is going to depend on your expertise and your policy goals. So to walk you through a quick example, let's say you research education policy. If we're going to look broadly, you'd find at the federal level, the U.S. Department of Education overseeing federal education policy at K through 12 and university levels. At the state level in Massachusetts, where SSN is based, you'd find the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. Then at the local level in Boston, there's Boston Public Schools, BPS. So all three levels are dealing with education, but their individual responsibilities vary depending on what they have authority over. So I think in the interest of time, if it seems difficult to break in, once you figured out where you're headed, remember that agencies will often coordinate their efforts across localities and issue areas. So if you can find one connection at a relevant agency, they might be able to plug you into the relationships and programs that would be most relevant to you. And sometimes it will be a matter of choice. Maybe your research applies at the federal, state, and local level. You can decide where you're most comfortable engaging, perhaps in the state or locality where you live, or hopefully where you already have a warm tie or someone who can connect you instead of just cold figuring out who you need to meet. Next is government agency structure. A unique aspect of government agencies that's a little different from legislative bodies is understanding how their organizational impacts form environment and they function in a hierarchy. So the head of the agency, typically appointed by elected officials, sits at the top and sets most of the agency's priorities. And can I just do a quick check on tech, because I'm getting a message that I was a little, Julianne, could you hear me okay now?
Yes, now there was a little delay for a second.
It wasn't too bad. Okay, great. Just wanting to make sure I was still there and that I wasn't completely kicked off because I could just keep going. So agency heads setting priorities, and then you see it trickling down through department leaders. They oversee large divisions of work. Underneath them, program staff. Program staff, as implied by the name, are the people who are running, monitoring, and informing programs and policies. Program staff know the policies they oversee very well, and they're probably experts in their specific foci. So lastly, there's service providers. Not all agencies have them, but whereas program staff oversee and monitor programs and consult on the future of policies, service providers would be the people actually on the ground with constituents. So for example, a state transportation agency may have a program staffer overseeing a policy to reduce fares for commuters, while the agency also has staffers, either directly employed or contracted, to carry out repairs or construction in the state. So the structure is different and more formal than you would find in a legislator's office or a civic organization. The formality and structure of the workplace is a result of the complex responsibilities an agency has, along with the transparency and accountability expected of them. Agencies have to deliver on the programs and services they're mandated to provide, and their work must be reported back to an executive or the legislature. They're tax funded, and therefore they're scrutinized by watchdog groups and elected officials. Even emails from agency staff are considered public record and can be disclosed. So really, it's no surprise that agencies have clear rules and expectations, both for their workflow and the individual autonomy of their staff. And there's even another layer to this, the political considerations that agencies have to take into account. So lots of reasons why sometimes these relationships can be a little bit harder to start, but that doesn't mean that they're not worth trying. I hope we've proved why there's just a wealth of power to actually influence policy in these organizations. So for you to inform them can be critical. Next slide is political considerations. So agency staff serve the people of the city or state or country, not a political party. They are expected to and legally required to be publicly politically neutral when they're acting in association with the agency, yet they also have to work very closely with political officials who oversee or decide on much of their work. So ultimate authority over an agency can vary. Some agencies are really independent, some are under legislative oversight, many fall under executive control. And you can expect their political relationships to be incredibly influential. So agencies are in a tricky and interesting position. They need to balance those relationships with their goal of providing services. Because elected officials can decide on much of their programs, staffing, and funding, agencies tend to be pretty responsive to the needs and priorities of elected officials. Agencies often receive questions from legislators and are typically considered subject matter experts by the legislators they work with. Executives like a governor can work closely with agencies to support or implement their policy goals. However, most staffers would be careful to do these things in a way that protected themselves and the agency, generally by sticking to the rules and leaning on their evidence. Some agencies have cultivated really good trusting relationships with the legislator and executives, and they can be involved with new policy formulation. Others less so, and they're concerned primarily with implementation and regulation. You can also expect an agency to have greater authority over existing programs, which are generally under less scrutiny than new programs, and that makes sense. So with changes in administration, executives can appoint new agency leaders. That means that agency priorities can shift at that time as well, especially for really highly politically fraught issues. Sometimes this means they have to shift their focus completely. Sometimes they do their best to continue programs, but have to more quietly or using different framing. And some things may be completely shelved and then return with a later administration. Next, we're going into agency staff. So because of the formal environment and the political pressures we just talked about, the way that policy is developed is different in agencies, especially when compared to a legislative office. And it's going to impact the way that you as a researcher can work with an agency. So it would be very rare for an agency staffer to get to just decide what the best course of action is, how their budget is spent, or what is the position of the agency on an issue. These decisions are typically made much higher up with the input of many, and they can depend on political considerations. So you can expect staff to pull in others as necessary and not make solo decisions like pulling you into a conversation. Along that line, staff are also not going to make public statements on their own. And this, again, is especially true for the most politicized issues. Agency language is going to be decided higher up. Communications would almost always go through a public affairs office. So don't expect a response. If you email a state health worker asking them to personally publish a statement on vaccine mandates, I doubt that's something someone in this room would try to do. It's not strange to not hear back from an agency staffer is one of the main points I think we're making here. Public speaking staffers doing so on behalf of the agency, like in a conference, would be in line with agency expectations. Do not expect to see a lot of differing or controversial opinions about their agency through social media or anything like that. So it can be sometimes more closed and formalized and harder to understand what exactly they're thinking. So why government agencies? Next slide. Knowing about why it might be more difficult for you to build relationships there. Even with these constraints in place, agency staffers are a unique resource and they're critical policy players. We just can't get around that. Agency staffers tend to have greater longevity than legislators. They don't have to turn over with an election. Some are career civil servants. They can be called upon as experts and provide insight and advice to legislators when policy is created. And it's really worth noting that with some staffers spending years, if not decades, working on their programs, they're deeply invested in these programs and they want to see successful evidence-based policies that they can support. They can have the best ability to understand academic language. We have to do a lot of work translating when we're talking about, say, a state legislative staffer. Sometimes agencies really are the folks that will be able to speak your language with you more fluently, and you'll have to put in less work to translate for them. So if you study specific programs, low-income housing, Medicaid, juvenile justice, agency partners are going to be some of the most passionate and knowledgeable decision makers out there, and they're making key decisions as they implement policies. So definitely still important. So how do you find the right one? Next slide. There's practical steps you can take to figure out what's the best partner for you, because it's about you being judicious with your time, right? Relationship building takes time and energy. So doing some work on the front end before you reach out to an agency staffer to ensure you're finding the right person that you want to invest your time in can really pay off. So first, folks would need to identify your research area and look to see which agencies carry out the programs or services that are relevant to you. Of course, you have to narrow down which level of government. Figuring out the right agency to contact can be dependent on the specific issue you're looking at. For example, context for Medicaid, you'd have to look at the state level because states are responsible for Medicaid. If you're looking at Medicare, you'd go to the federal level. We all understand how that plays into the different levels. Here's an example that my colleague Joanna put in. If you're studying teacher supports in North Carolina, you would find after a quick Google search that North Carolina Education Agency would bring up the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. But who else can help point you in the right direction besides doing a Google search and seeing what that agency is actually called, because they all have different names for your different areas. As with everything in relationship building, you want to make sure that you've done your work to seek out warm ties first. Is there anyone in your network who could help you as opposed to you striking out alone? This is where FABBS can be a great resource. Everyone I've worked with at FABBS has great connections that they can help you think of names you haven't heard of yet, or just, being able to hand over your email in a way that's warm and will ensure that it's read. SSN is another space that can, be a resource for you. We're definitely expanding our work with agencies. Certainly the making of this presentation put us into community with a lot of agency staffers. That's where we got a lot of the knowledge that we're relaying to you today. So think of us, especially if you have a local chapter. And this is the place to think about your institution, wherever you are faculty, and the connections your college or university may have. Don't neglect your government relations office. This is a space, Julianne, if you had further ideas, it would be great to put them in the chat. Again, we don't want to skimp on that step where you review your own network first and see if there's any way you can just leapfrog a little bit toward the person you want to be in touch with. So once you have narrowed in on that right agency, you need to do a little homework. You want to know the context before you reach out, so you have a sense of their work and possible opportunities, priorities, and deadlines. Get on their listservs, read public statements from the agency if there are any, look at budget documents. These can be harder to find than, say, the contact information for a legislator. But if you're Googling for task forces, agency working groups, program officers, you'll find what you're looking for eventually. And then you want specific individual staff members to contact, their actual names and titles. At the federal level, you could try a program officer, but federal level responsibilities and structure can shift, and they also tend to be low on capacity, and that was the evidence that we found. Instead, look to see if the agency has a research office in particular. They're going to be the most invested in employing research, and maybe the most willing to speak with you. For example, the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation is within the Office of the Administration for Children and Families. So again, they're going to have different names and titles. There's not a super clear pattern to it, but that's a good place to start. And it's important, once you are connected with a staffer, thinking of how you can use them to build your network for the future. So agency staff are highly networked within the agency, sometimes across agencies, sometimes among the levels, federal, state, and local. Some people have success in starting at one level and working your way up. That's another way. If you're being stonewalled at the federal level, if your research is relevant, consider a step down and see if you can move up later. Agencies are really intricately connected, and they can help source other connections for you once you've made a warm connection. All right, so now that we are just about halfway through, you all took some time at the beginning, and we can advance to the next slide, I think, for this. I think I made it correctly. So I'd like everyone, you've already thought about it some because I asked you to put it in the chat when we started, but just go back and think, all right, what is the agency that I'm targeting? Why is our big question. We'd love it if someone could share, and it's fine, I think, if we do it in the chat, and maybe we'll try to read some. What is the one thing that you want to communicate to your chosen audience, and why is it important for them to know it? And I know I'm asking you to be brief, which can be difficult, but that's part of the point, because we always want to be honing our language and making sure that it's as clear as possible. And I've asked Julianne to maybe share something if it takes us a minute to get started. I'm not sure if she did have a sample connect to an agency idea yet.
Hey, Lizzy. I mean, I do think we have a couple of people on the call who are, and I don't want to call out Mary, but maybe I'll invite you, who is has worked on this. Oh, here, I think she's putting it in the chat. So I'd love to use this moment to bring attention. Mary, I don't know if you want to come off mute, or if Lizzy, you just want to read what she's written in the chat.
If she doesn't mind, I'd love to hear it in her own words.
Sure.
Thank you, Mary.
So there's legislation, the Family First or FFPSA legislation, that is intended to have states use evidence-based treatment for children in the child welfare system. But one of the criteria that ACF adopted, or that the group that they worked with adopted, was to not allow studies for admission or for consideration that used active control groups. So I'm wanting ACF to reconsider the criteria that they're using, because that doesn't make sense to me. That's not how NIH makes their funding decisions for providing funding for these interventions as they're being developed.
I love that because it is clearly an evidence-based recommendation. You have clear reasons to present. This is why this is not doing the thing that you actually need to be doing. And it's a perfect example of, I feel like, what we hear most often that folks want to communicate to agencies, which is this thing you're doing is either wrong or could be improved in this other way. And it's so important because you're certainly so right, and you certainly have your evidence, and it can be really difficult to do for some of the reasons, that we've covered about what are their political considerations, who actually made that decision and why, what ability would folks who implement these programs have to actually talk to you candidly about that. And that can sometimes be really unclear. And so, we want to think creatively with everyone who has something like this about how do I present this information in a way that clearly shows it comports with their, want to help them as opposed to something they're doing. No, it is that, fully said. And how do I build a relationship with people who ultimately may have decision-making power in this space that's going to put me at their kitchen table, when they are actually able to use their power to make that decision? How many steps is that going to take? Are there steps between, my introduction to them and talking to them and building that relationship and my actually handing over, this is my goal, this is the thing I'd like you to be able to do? It's tricky, and clearly it's very worthwhile because folks like you, who have real evidence-based, very specific policies that clearly are under agencies' control, we want those relationships to happen. So I'll be interested to see how that goes.
Thank you.
If anyone else wants to volunteer something, otherwise, I look forward to going through these later.
Lizzy, I'll go ahead and give just two other examples that come to mind. Some of our researchers who contributed to our PIBS journal had been writing about sort of guidelines for appropriate number of words at certain stages of development, and found that the CDC guidance did not reflect the evidence that was pretty well established. And so that was one area. I mean, that's still a work in progress. And something that other people might be familiar with is how knowledge about adolescent brain development has successfully, and this was before my time at FABBS, but impacted decisions about the age of death penalty, and in the future might impact appropriate age to own a gun. But that there was a case that my understanding is that the research on adolescent brain development was very definitely and intentionally included during those discussions and brought to the attention by researchers.
Excellent. Thank you. And thank you, especially for sharing that, and Mary, for your example, because I think those, even though these are, that's something of a case study. I hope for the person, there was someone who put in the chat that they were interested in actual narratives of how this is done, which is very correct. And we love doing that at SSN, and hope that's a good idea to have some for agency relationships specifically soon. All right, we will get back into it, and we'll hopefully have some room at the end if there's other questions, or if there's more share outs, or anyone would like feedback on what they're thinking of doing with agencies. So to remember, and we say this in a lot of SSN trainings, it's pretty important. Agency staff are just people. We're hoping that, by this point in the workshop, you have a better idea of what agencies need and how they work and what their expectations and limitations are. And this framing of agencies is important to have because it should really inform the way you look to make contact and communicate with them. But at the same time, you have to remember that agency staff are still just people. They want to see their work succeed. They want to serve their constituents. They appreciate people who want to support them doing those things. We heard from every agency staffer we spoke to in the course of designing this training that they need and value external research and data, and they want to turn to people they know and trust to help them create and implement evidence-based policies. So agencies can seem more opaque or difficult to break into, not just seem that way. I think agencies are more opaque and difficult to break into. But what we've learned is that relationships are still at the core of policy change within agencies. So agency staff in particular will rely on trusted partners. And by making intentional efforts to make those connections, you can strike up an impactful relationship with them. That's still true, even though they have different rules. I think I have one slide next about different levels of relationships. And I'm glad I left this in because I saw a lot in the chat that people actually were very open and were interested in helping have that decision made. So there are some differences between the ways relationships can come about at the different levels, although I want to stress here that there aren't hard and fast rules about engaging at different levels. So at the end of the day, it's going to come down to the person that you've reached out to. But there are still some things to keep in mind. So we found that relationships tend to get progressively more formal as you move up the federal up to the federal level. So the local level relationships may be at their most casual or one-on-one, and at the federal level, we found staff had more of a tendency to expect contact with researchers through contractual relationships or formal partnerships. And that makes sense considering everything we just discussed. So federal government with high levels of oversight and reporting tends to operate within the most formal environments, terms, payments, expectations, very clear for engaging with researchers. This has some obvious benefits since both sides are able to be really clear about what they're setting out to accomplish. They'll have concrete policy goals attached and everyone will be aware of them. That's always great. Local governments with more community engagement, lower capacity for internal research, and fluid relationships with elected officials tend to have slightly less rigid rules and hierarchies. And state governments would probably fall roughly in the middle, but that can really depend on the size and capacity of the state legislature. So what this means for scholars is that staff at the local or state level may be more open to or more flexible with forming new relationships with outside researchers. Local and state level staffers may be more comfortable identifying scholars themselves and proactively asking for you, since they can look to local or state universities to find researchers who align with their needs and who they assume will have some understanding of a local context. But what we found is that it's still often the case that federal staffers need expertise or research that they can't get through a grant or a contract. So we want to emphasize that new relationships, including one-on-one and informal relationships, are possible and they're needed at every level of government. Next slide, formal partnerships. Some relationships between scholars and government agencies happen through formal partnerships or contractual agreements. This is often between an agency and a university or a research group, and it typically includes funding or payment of some kind. These are mutually beneficial relationships. Agencies are offering funding, access to data, and a built-in opportunity to connect and collaborate with staff. And in return, of course, they get the research or data that they need, and they get to set specific research questions and goals. So you can look for grant opportunities, though I like to add the caveat here that these typically are given to a group or university as opposed to a single researcher, but many of you here today might be representing research groups. And it is sam.gov, and I completely forgot to copy this over when we started, so that would be easy for me to put it in the chat, but here it is. Nonetheless, this is the site federal agencies use to post requests for proposals. So definitely, scan through that if it's something that seems like you might have relevant research. Even with contract or grant between a researcher and an agency, the relationship still really matters. A grant's an excellent way to open the door and gain a deeper understanding of an agency staffer's needs and a chance to deliver for them. But if you're hoping to make a longer term impact, you want to think carefully about how to develop and sustain that relationship over the long term after the contract ends. So agencies who find valuable and responsive partnerships sometimes are able to extend or renew contracts or funding, or include them in future research or conversations. These kinds of formal partnerships can run the gamut from a full research project, creating an actual product, or putting together a compilation of research, but they're usually a complete or full project of some kind. This wouldn't happen for like a one-off question or a research need that an agency had. That's where the more informal partnerships are essential. So that's why we also can't leave that off the table. Informal partnerships, on our next slide, are the kind of relationships where agency staffers can turn to researchers to answer pressing questions or access needed information or context. What we've learned is that agency staff typically source expertise from their networks. Some staff said they would go looking through publications for relevant expertise if they needed it. Some do reach out, but it can be difficult for them to find the time to do so. So agency staff who may have a dozen things on their to-do list in a day would definitely find it difficult to start looking through published articles for the expert they need. It gets more complicated by the fact that much of that research is, of course, behind a paywall. If you're anything other than federal level, you may not have access to those journals. So it's another reason that agency staff may hesitate to reach out to scholars to ask questions. Staffers feel that they need to be careful when striking up new conversations and relationships because they do not want to give the impression that they are able to offer payment or funding when they do not have the budget or the authority to do so. So like we mentioned earlier, there's a more rigid structure to agencies. There's rules that they have to follow, including how money is spent. And for these reasons, it's often easier for them to go to the people that they already know. If you're the researcher who they consider their colleague, their go-to person, why would they risk talking to a new person, maybe not getting what they needed, giving them the wrong impression, entangling themselves? So that's why building informal relationships still is going to take your time and effort. But to be that person can be very valuable as an expert. So making informal connections. How do we do it? One outlet that agency staff have is turning to scholars they already are in a formal relationship with. Maybe there's a grant in place for one research project, but if a question or an issue arises that's somewhat related, they often direct those questions to the researchers they're already formally working with. If you find yourself in that situation, try your very best to answer. That's a great relationship builder. Being responsive and flexible makes a big impression and helps build trust. It doesn't say this in my script, but we at SSN always have to mention that if you are not the right person to answer a question that you get, see if you can hand it off to someone in your network. That way you're still maintaining the relationship for yourself, but you're also strengthening it for colleagues. Another important opportunity would be to connect through civic organizations or joint working groups. So agencies often work in collaboration with civic orgs or community partners because they directly can serve constituents. They'll usually make an effort to be available and responsive to community orgs. So researchers are often included in working groups, and those participants can become a warm contact for the agency. This can be especially true at the local level. As you get more local, you get both less resources and capacity and a greater integration with the community. So there's more mixes of government and organizations and nonprofits. We also heard from several agency staff that conferences are an ideal place to make connections, especially when they're back in person, as we know is happening more and more. The agency staff that attend research and policy conferences have self-selected in a way. They've shown their interest in research, and you also get them away from the office and can have more in-depth conversations. So give them your card, follow up over email to remind them who you are. That would be a great relationship starter. And again, leverage your institutions or department's government affairs office. They may have direct connections with state agency offices. They may know who to contact, how to contact them, who's looking for more expertise. It's really worth your time just to see what your GAO has. And then open opportunities for connecting with agencies. That's next. There's openings where government agencies are specifically calling for external feedback, or at least have opportunities for members of the community, such as researchers, to get involved. So of course, there's public comments. These are opportunities for folks who are outside of government to provide input on proposed government actions. I am about to drop. This is the now in the chat. That's the website where federal agencies are required to provide their opportunities for public comment. And when proposing a new rule or regulation, you'll see all the list of current open comment periods that sometimes have pretty clear instructions for what they're looking for and also dates of when you need to submit it. A few tips for public comments. Make sure you are very familiar with the regulation before you submit. It's important to include the regulation name and docket ID number in the heading if you can. Use some of your word count to establish your expertise. Why are you someone that they should be listening to and not just any person off the street who's allowed to make a public comment? And as always, be sure to be clear and concise. No jargon, not overly long. You will absolutely catch the attention of agency staffers if you're able to write that way as a researcher. Another tip is to look at what kind of open access rules a state has in place. So some agencies are required to have openings for community members to connect and attend meetings or submit comments. An example here, the Alabama Open Meeting Act requires agency public meetings to be listed and available for anyone to attend. Some localities allow people to attend and speak at budget hearings. These are all of these actual physical events, or sometimes over Zoom. These are good places to spot potential partners and remember the name of a person who might be who you're looking for to connect with. You don't necessarily need to go through these channels that we've talked about so far, though. You can cold reach out to agency staff. Again, every staff member we spoke to said they'd be interested in hearing from a scholar whose expertise was relevant to them. It just becomes a question of how to go about it in the right way. So, nearing the finish line, our next slide, making a connection. If you want to connect with an agency in relation to your research, we invite people, if at all possible, to reach out at the beginning of a project. Something we heard quite often in our interviews is that agencies get frustrated when they hear from scholars after the research is done to find out that they weren't asked any of the questions they wanted to know the answer to. Agencies are in the best position to know what data and research is needed to implement or improve their programs. That does not mean that the crux of your research needs to change. And we say that to everyone that we work with at SSN who we're asking to maybe work with, an outside policy decision maker as they begin building a project. But if a minor shift or a small addition could provide them with critical information, and that's a really great relationship builder. So do not reach out to an agency with the sole purpose of accessing their data. If you need their data, go into it with the goal of collaboration. And if you are reaching out after your research is done, or you're looking to provide your expertise more generally, make sure you've really done your homework and you know as much as is publicly available to know about the context of that agency and whatever you want to talk to about. So what programs are in motion that are relevant to your expertise? What do you have to offer? What relevant deadlines or opportunities are there that you might want to take advantage of, or at least know about and not run into? What are the annual or biannual rhythms of government? When is their budget due? When is it passed? When's the legislative session? Most agencies get to submit their own suggestions for their budget and are involved in the legislative session. So this is still important to keep an eye on. So if you do make contact with a staffer and you're able to show that you're familiar with their work and you've taken the time to get yourself up to speed, they're just going to be that much more inclined to taking the time to speak with you. And when you have made that connection, you have to try to be as responsive as you can. Agency staff may pop up with unexpected questions or opportunities. It can be really tricky to work on their schedules, but if you can, try to be as responsive as possible, and this shows them that you're a valuable resource and incentivizes them to include you in future conversations. So now we do have some time for the next slide. We're going to get into some concrete tips about outreach. So whether this is cold outreach to an agency staffer you have found and selected, or if it's someone that you have maybe something of a warm tie to, or someone else is handing over a connection, these are the things that you should think about when you're making that first conversational volley to try to build a relationship with them. Everyone we have ever spoken to at SSN, when we're putting together our trainings and asking what people working in policy want, they always really appreciate short and concise emails from researchers. They do not expect you all as researchers and faculty to write that way. And when you can, that makes you stand out. Agency staff get dozens of emails a day. You do not want to overwhelm them at first glance. Your motivation for reaching out is a key thing to be clear about. At the federal level, especially, staffers said they might be hesitant to connect with someone out of the blue for a few reasons. First, vendors and contractors will reach out trying to sell a service or product or secure funding or make a personal case for getting a grant or contract. And they're going to be wary of making connections if it seems like there should or might be an expectation of payment that they can't give. It was really clear in our interviews that this was something they thought about a lot, and maybe something that we as the people reaching out to them thought a little bit less about, so be aware of it. Agency staff want to avoid the appearance of being lobbied. They are expected to be politically neutral and to be highly aware of the political environment. And that's all to say that it would be a risk to their jobs to engage with someone who is being obviously politically motivated or critical of the policy decision makers they serve. So I think we're going to talk about that a little bit more before we close, but even your email should, if possible, reflect that context. If you have something to attach, like a brief, folks who've written for the day one project, anything that is meant to be short and jargon free and explain to them, what your research offers them, or at least gives them an example of how you can do translational writing, is going to be helpful for them to remember you. It gives them an opportunity to share or disseminate something among their colleagues. You can include permission to share with other people in the body of the email. Don't just send them your journal article. We were definitely uniformly told they were not going to read that. It might frustrate them when they see that that's all that you have to offer, something they could have found themselves or can't access or isn't written in language that they can easily understand. And finally, expect to be persistent. As we said, they get lots of emails, things slip through the cracks. Don't be afraid to nudge once or twice. The worst that can happen is they ignore you and you move on to the next contact. So on our next slide, we have an email template, and I will make sure that this gets sent out to whomever to disseminate among everyone who came today, because it is just nice to have as a Word doc and be able to give it your own flair and repurpose it. But it really gets the job done. And again, we see so many emails, even my own, that are longer than they need to be. And we've gotten a lot of positive response from using a template that really helps you get in and get out of the conversation and make sure the person you're writing knows why you're writing them. So they should be able to read the first 3 to 4 sentences and understand who you are and why you're contacting them. And here you can show them just that little bit of that you are indeed familiar with the agency and their work. Prove that you did that homework. They should also be able to tell what you want. So you need a concrete offer or next step. Folks who end an email to an agency staffer, or really anyone in the policy space, saying, let me know if you're interested in research. It's not concrete enough. If you want to reach out to someone, you should be asking to meet with them, to speak with them, to send them something, something that actually gets done. So again, put that ask about talking or meeting, setting some kind of connection. You want to get them off of email and into another format that's going to have more room for warmth, more room for relationship building, more room for nuance as soon as you can. And on the next slide, we have some examples of what these rules can look like in practice. It's really important to think carefully about the way you communicate with agency staff. I feel like a lot of what we've covered so far has shown that there's plenty of pitfalls and things you might say and not even realize that you were putting them in a position where maybe they thought, I need to cool off on this person. The overarching rule of short, concise, and no jargon always applies. Agency staff may very well have a deeper understanding of what the issue is than, say, a legislator, but they're still really busy. You can't be sure exactly what their expertise is, and they would want the ability to use materials with other stakeholders outside of their immediate colleagues as well. So once you've built out more of a trusting relationship with agency staff, you'll be able to speak more directly with them about what kinds of resources and materials they want and in what form. But if you're providing them with a memo or a summary, remember it should be written still with policymakers writ large and their ability to understand your language in mind. Working with agencies should ideally be a back and forth conversation. So don't come in with just the goal of informing them of what you found and then leaving. Ask what they need, learn about their priorities, their expectations, their long-term goals. See if you can collaborate on a mutually beneficial relationship, or maybe something that does involve a formal contract. Next, you want to stay aware of the political environment. So remember, agencies are responsive to legislators and elected officials. Their political relationships are really important. Frame your communications as politically neutral when appropriate. You can see what kind of recent language and framing they have used and try to mirror that language back to them. Not only does that show you're paying attention, it lets them know that they can trust you and that you understand the environment that they're working in. I want to emphasize again here that the staffers we spoke to made it clear that they did not want or expect the actual resource or recommendations to change, whatever your research to change. It was about finding partners that they could trust to understand the political environment they were operating under, and make whatever progress or changes they could within that environment. They really appreciated folks who intuited that. Lastly, you also want to do your background research and see if the policy you're trying to influence has been done before, how well it fared, maybe in another state. Having that context can help you avoid politically charged minefields like the failure of a previous program, and help you be more practical with your goals so that you can be focusing on things that are feasible to accomplish. lastly, on our next slide, how do you define success? We want to acknowledge that engaging in policy can be really challenging and sometimes a frustrating process. Sometimes it can be difficult to know how to measure success or know if what you're doing is working. So it's fair to say that it sometimes takes a few tries to get the right audience before the relationship building can even begin. But we've also seen that by taking the time to reach out, build trust, and offer resources, researchers have had amazing success in creating lasting relationships with policymakers. So this is how we like to define success, not in one policy or one bill, but being in a position where policymakers are returning to you for advice. That's a big thing that we look for at SSN and try to encourage in the relationships that we're helping be built. Being a trusted resource means you're able to provide support and input, not just on one thing, but on all kinds of policies that are in your area of expertise, or help source your colleagues for areas that aren't exactly in your area of expertise. And so that's it. We're near the end of our time together. Maybe for once in my life, I actually went a little too fast because I really wanted to fit it in. But that means that we do have time for questions or discussion. And I know that one thing we were really interested in now that we've sat through this is, what barriers have folks already encountered, or what do you anticipate countering as you begin this work? And I certainly can't guarantee that we would fix anyone's problems today, but at SSN, we really appreciate hearing from you what your issues are so that we can think about programming that would support them. And you can even take us off the main slide share so that we can see everybody. Yes.
Lizzy,
Okay,
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Before we start the questions, if people do, just put your hand up. A couple things. There was a comment at the end about the possibility that your slides could be shared. So if possible, let us know. This is being recorded, so they'll be available in that form. And there was an early question, kind of a little orthogonal, about job opportunities in the system. So you might want to comment on that. And at this point, I'll just open it up to any other questions. So I don't see any hands up. So I would, while hands are getting, go ahead.
Hello, my name is DeLeon Gray. I am a faculty member at NC State University. I have a question. Regarding the informal partnerships, I really love the idea of those, and I just wanted to see if I can understand those correctly. So, politically charged environments could mean that someone from an agency could be trying to get things done that can advance something for, let's say, historically marginalized populations, but because there's a lot of political backlash that they may, kind of experience, they may need to turn to a trusted partner who is familiar with the evidence base on the issue, where they can speak more candidly and have the evidence that they need to advocate, or at least, provide input on some policy issue, recommendation, implementation issue moving forward. I think that's what I'm gathering from it, for something that's useful for my purposes, but I just wanted to get your insights on the way I'm thinking about that.
The formal relationship is one that would have like a contract or a grant that is a project that a researcher from an institution like yours has formally engaged in with the agency. And an informal relationship is one where that has not occurred. So this person might be speaking to you. I mean, it might be as simple as like off the record completely as a friend, a researcher I trust, and I'm having trouble wrapping my mind around an issue or the way it's discussed. But it would be more about they're working on a project, maybe even a project that does include formal relationships with other researchers, and they need some further context to something. They're looking to source, someone who's analyzed data in a different state or a different context, and you as an outside researcher could provide that type of support to them. So it's less even about being candid. I would hope that and talking about things that may be politically charged and that they're not able to speak their personal mind about as being representative of the agency. That's like a very high level of a trusting relationship where someone maybe you've been working with for a long time and there's been a lot of trust built up there. So a formal or an informal relationship could both be pathways to a space where that could happen. The informal one is just the one where you don't have like grant deliverables or a timed contract or a clear project that you're working on together. Julianne, I see you nodding, but I wasn't sure if you had things to add there.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, even sometimes sending an executive summary, or I'm familiar with the article you published in FABBS about the diversity in teachers, right? DeLeon, am I correct that you were the author? Well, I'm remembering an article. And so even sometimes sharing and saying, wanted to let you know that this is something you're working on, wanted to let you know I have some knowledge here. So you're not necessarily trying to accomplish anything. You're just sort of, hi, I'm here in case you need me. You know what I mean? I think those are some nice ways. They don't always get to the top of your to-do list, but I think that lays the groundwork.
Yes, yes, that's very helpful. And yes, that was my article. It was on belonging. And I won't hog the mic, but I'm seeing local policy folks showing up to the things that I'm just doing in communities, and I'm not inviting them, but they are showing up and saying, hey, can you help a little bit more on these issues? So I'm just trying to make sense of what that is. So that was where I was coming from.
Thank you. So Lane Jackson Hubbard has a question that says, for someone completely new to working with agencies, what is the recommended approach to get started? For example, searching SAM.gov or regulations.gov for keywords related to our research to find related agencies or regulations. So what do you recommend?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you are starting from ground zero and what you know is what your research says, and you want to figure out who are the people that I need to be getting that research to, then yes, I think starting big, great, figure out actually is relevant, very figuring out actual agency in charge, what are the different roles within that agency, that should help you narrow it down. But the other thing that we brought up and that Julianne keeps bringing up, which is true, is yes, do that work and figure it out. But once you have some general areas in mind, or even some target names in mind, you want to see if you can ping folks within your network who may have connections to those people to make sure that you would be going through that route instead of doing a cold connection, if at all possible. So we always want to try to build a trusted relationship by building off of a relationship you already have. That'll give you just that little bit more cachet and trustability when you start. But yeah, it's an exciting time for you if you really are just thinking really big about like, here's what I know, who's the person that needs it. That's a great moment to be at. And you will find that person who both has the ability to make the changes that you want to see made, and the ability to be someone who has a relationship with you, speaks your language, whatever that means for you as a researcher.
Thank you. We're going to have one last question. So this is from Alexis Milton. It says, how does this route differ from policy analysts that are hired?
I mean, the main way is the policy analyst that's hired, their assignment is to analyze the policies that are put toward them. And you are all researchers working within you all have a variety of limitations that are put on you, but also devising your own areas of inquiry and your own studies. We just want you, if you're going to do research that could have a policy impact, we want to help you make that impact in a way that's effective and productive. And so relationship building with agencies or any government actors that may sometimes have power in your space is a way for you to take part in that policy informing process. But you are always still deciding what your own research subjects are, what gaps you're filling, what knowledge you're producing, as opposed to an analyst who would be performing the action that was specifically required of them. There are definitely cases where you build a relationship with, say, a legislator, and they may want you to sort of act as a policy analyst for you. And at that point, it would be up to you to decide, what capacity do you have? What is actually your goals in the relationship with them? But otherwise, I think the main difference is simply that you are researchers first. You are doing your research, you are publishing, you are often teaching faculty as well. And that's always going to be your primary role. And this is the way you can make sure you're doing this important work with agencies without taking over your life and spending too much of your time on it.
Thank you. So as someone who's been on both sides of this equation, what I would say is that stay engaged, be pleasant, be positive, but be persistent, and try to make it a relationship, find the right people and work together to move forward both your interests, the interests of your communities, and the things you want to do. I want to thank all of you who have participated today in this, and remind you to, if you have questions and concerns, to contact FABBS, contact SSN. And again, I want a particular thanks to Lizzy for an absolutely excellent presentation. Again, this is being recorded. The PowerPoint will be shared. I hope that the stuff in the chat will also be shared. It'll show up eventually, at least on the FABBS, and I assume on the SSN site, perhaps not.